The summer Sebastian Hale, Duke of Sorrel, arrived in Winchester, the city had already decided what would happen next. It was not malice. It was simply the machinery of a cathedral close in late August, the same machinery that had been running, with minor variations, since before the current bishop's father was ordained. There were 3 families worth knowing, 2 assembly rooms worth attending, 1 lending library where the same volumes circulated endlessly among the same hands, passed with significant looks, and occasional penciled annotations that everyone pretended not to notice. Into this small, self-satisfied world arrived a duke, freshly disentangled from an engagement that had occupied London gossip for the better part of 2 years, and the city set about the business of deciding his future with the quiet efficiency of a committee that had been expecting exactly this sort of agenda item. The 3 candidates were selected before Sebastian had unpacked his trunk. Lady Portia Lennox was staying with her aunt on the Close and was, by general agreement, the obvious choice. She was 24, handsome in the decisive way of women who have been told so since childhood and have decided to make it useful, and her conversation was the sort that made drawing rooms feel more important than they were. She was not vain. She was simply aware of her own value and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Sebastian had met her twice in London. She had made an impression both times. Miss Diana Carew lived in Winchester proper, the eldest daughter of a retired colonel, with more books than furniture, and more opinions than either. She was 26, striking rather than beautiful, with the kind of intelligence that expressed itself in direct questions and a habit of watching people slightly longer than was strictly polite. She had decided at some point that Sebastian Hale might be worth her attention. She went about this assessment with the frank efficiency of someone who did not intend to waste either his time or hers. Miss Sophia Eldridge was the warmth in the room, any room. She was 22, connected to half the county through her mother's family, and universally liked in the uncomplicated way of people who have never said a sharp thing in their lives and genuinely haven't wanted to. Sebastian's mother had mentioned her in a letter that arrived the day he left London. The letter had been 3 pages. Sophia Eldridge had occupied 2 of them. These were the women Winchester had selected. It was discussing little else. Harriet Beaumont was not discussed at all. She was present at the first assembly, had been present at Winchester assemblies for 3 years, since her mother's death had made Bath impractical and London unthinkable, and this city had offered the decent middle ground of familiar society with no expectation of performance. She was 27, she was a baronet's daughter, which was respectable without being remarkable. She wore grey silk that evening, which was either mourning adjacent or simply a preference for grey. Nobody had thought to ask. She stood near the windows with a glass she was not drinking from and watched the room with the unhurried attention of someone who found people genuinely interesting and had no need to announce the fact. Sebastian noticed her before the introductions began. He was not sure why at first. There was nothing to notice in the conventional sense. She was not performing for the room, not positioned for advantage, not watching him the way the room was watching him. She was watching a conversation near the fireplace with an expression of mild private amusement, as though she had heard the punchline coming 3 exchanges earlier and was now waiting politely for everyone else to catch up. He was introduced to Portia Lennox first, then Diana Carew, then Sophia Eldridge, who shook his hand with such warmth that he felt briefly that they had known each other for years. The room watched all 3 introductions with the focused attention of people who believe they are being subtle. Harriet Beaumont he found himself next to by accident, or what felt like accident, 40 minutes later at the edge of the refreshment table, both of them having arrived at the lemonade from opposite directions at the same moment. "Your Grace," said the woman who had apparently been standing against the wall all evening without anyone mentioning her. He did not have her name. "Beaumont," she said without apparent concern at being nameless. "Harriet Beaumont. My father is Sir Edmund Beaumont. We are entirely unremarkable, and you will have been given no reason to remember us." He looked at her. "You say that as though it's a point in your favour." "As it happens," she said, "I find it rather restful." It was not the wittiest thing he had ever heard. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him since he arrived in Winchester, and possibly since he arrived in Hampshire, and possibly for somewhat longer than that. He picked up a glass of lemonade. She picked up one of her own. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the room. "Lady Portia," said Harriet without preamble, "is going to ask you to partner her in the next set. She has been working her way around the room in a direction that will place her at your left elbow in approximately 4 minutes. Sebastian turned to look. She was right. And you are telling me this because... Because forewarned is forearmed, Harriet said, and because Lady Portia is a perfectly lovely woman who deserves a partner who arrives knowing the situation, rather than one who stumbles into it and spends the entire reel looking slightly confused. She paused. That is not a commentary on your intelligence. It is a commentary on the nature of first assemblies. As you say, said Sebastian. She glanced at him. The corner of her mouth moved. Precisely. He partnered Lady Portia for the next set. He was not confused. The pattern established itself over the following week with the inexorable logic of Winchester society. Sebastian rode in the mornings. He called in the afternoons, at the Lennox house on Tuesday, at the Carews on Wednesday, at the Eldridges on Thursday, with the conscientiousness of a man who understood his position and intended to discharge it properly. He attended the cathedral concert on Friday evening and sat between Diana Carew and Sophia Eldridge, which produced a small crisis of seating arrangement that resolved itself with the cheerful diplomacy of their respective mothers. He walked on the close on Saturday morning and encountered Lady Portia, who was also walking, in the company of her maid, and, it appeared, a carefully chosen route. He was not unkind to any of them. He was not performing interest he did not feel. He had made that vow to himself on the road out of London, after the dissolution of the engagement that had been, from first to last, a piece of careful social architecture dressed as a love match. He would not do that again, not to himself and not to anyone else. What he did not say to himself, quite yet, was that he was spending a noticeable portion of every social occasion looking for grey silk. Harriet Beaumont appeared at events the way furniture appears in a room you have lived in long enough to stop seeing, and then one day you notice a chair has been moved 6 inches and the room feels entirely wrong. She was at the concert, 4 rows back, listening with her hands folded and her attention entirely on the music. She was at the Eldridge's garden party, in conversation with an elderly clergyman who appeared to be explaining something about ecclesiastical architecture while she asked questions that made him talk for 20 minutes without pausing. She was at the lending library on Tuesday morning. Sebastian passed it on his way to call on Portia and saw her through the window, standing at a shelf with a book open in her hands, reading a page before she committed to borrowing it, as though she took the obligation seriously. He did not go in. There was no reason to go in. On Wednesday he went in. She was there again, which suggested either a pattern or coincidence. Sebastian, who had spent 2 years watching a family construct an engagement from coincidences, was inclined to believe in patterns. She was returning a volume of sermons. On behalf of my father, she said when she noticed him, and was apparently undecided between 2 histories of the Civil War period. She held them both with the air of someone conducting a private deliberation that had been interrupted. "Do you require a recommendation?" Sebastian asked. "Do you know them?" "The Clarendon I know well, the other I've not read." "Then you can only recommend one," she said, "which halves the usefulness of the exercise." She considered. "Though I suppose knowing that Clarendon is worth reading is more useful than knowing nothing." "High praise." "I find excessive praise tends to mislead." She returned the other volume to the shelf. "I shall begin with the one that comes recommended and form my own conclusions from there. And if you disagree with my assessment..." She tucked the book under her arm. "Then I shall tell you so." She said it with perfect equanimity, as though disagreeing with a duke was a perfectly ordinary undertaking that she had performed several times before and found untroubling. He walked out of the library in a better mood than he had been in for some weeks, without being able to explain why. The second assembly was larger than the first. Several families had arrived from neighbouring estates, and the room had the slightly compressed energy of a space that was hosting more people than it had anticipated. Sebastian arrived with the Lennox party, which was not his arrangement, but had become the arrangement through a series of small social manoeuvres he had observed without preventing. He danced the first set with Lady Portia, who was an excellent dancer and knew it. He danced the second with Sophia Eldridge, who was not technically excellent, but so genuinely delighted to be dancing that it made no difference. He was in conversation with Diana Carew during the third set. She had opinions about the militia, quartered outside the city, that were brisk and well-reasoned, and made him laugh twice, when he noticed Harriet Beaumont accepting a partner for the same set. The partner was a Mr. Gerald Ashford, no relation to any anything Sebastian needed to concern himself with, a pleasant, well-dressed man of about 30, who was, Sebastian was told by Diana without being asked, visiting his sister in the Close, and was considered by several of the younger ladies to be a very agreeable addition to the season. Harriet danced with Mr. Ashford, with the same composed attention she brought to everything. She said something during the figure that made him laugh. He said something back that made her smile, a real smile, not the polite version. "Your Grace," said Diana Carew. "Forgive me," said Sebastian. "You were saying about the militia's provisions." "I was," said Diana, "though I notice I had lost you for a moment. The room is distracting." "Rooms often are," said Diana, and looked at him with the frank assessment she applied to most things. She did not pursue it. He appreciated that about her. He called on Sir Edmund Beaumont the following Thursday. There was no particular reason for the call, no social obligation, no prior introduction beyond the assembly rooms, no opening gambit arranged by anyone's mother. He told himself he was making the rounds of the respectable families in the Close, and that the Beaumonts were a respectable family in the Close, and that this was sufficient explanation. Sir Edmund was a comfortable man in his late 50s, slightly distracted, with the vague warmth of someone who has been well loved and knows it. He received Sebastian in a sitting room that was slightly too full of books and not quite full enough of furniture, offered him tea he had to ask a maid to actually arrange, and spent the first 10 minutes asking interested questions about Sorrel's estates in Derbyshire, that suggested he had once read something about the region and retained it. Harriet appeared with the tea tray, not a servant's task, but the tray had apparently been mislaid and the maid was new, and set it down with the brisk competence of someone who had been managing a household long enough to find it unremarkable. "Miss Beaumont," said Sebastian. "Your Grace." She poured tea without looking up. "I trust you take it without ceremony." "I do." "Good. We are a household that runs short of ceremony on Thursdays." Sir Edmund chuckled. This appeared to be an established dynamic. Sebastian accepted his cup and noted that she sat, when the tea was arranged, not in the chair nearest her father, but in the one nearest the window, positioned, he thought, to leave without disrupting the conversation if she chose to. She did not choose to. She stayed and listened, and spoke twice, once to correct a date her father had wrong, once to add a piece of information about the Derbyshire estates that was more accurate than his own public account of them, which surprised him enough that he looked at her directly. "You've read about Sorel," he said. "The county history has a chapter," she said with perfect neutrality. "I read comprehensively." "As you say," said Sebastian. He was beginning to understand that this was not his phrase. She looked up. There it was again, that small movement at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more considered. He stayed longer than a call required. Sir Edmund showed no sign of noticing. Harriet showed every sign of noticing and said nothing about it. The thing about Winchester in late summer was that it had very few places to be private and a very great many ways to be observed. Sebastian had learned this about London long ago, that the performance of public life had its own geometry, and that the art was not in avoiding observation, but in knowing which observations you could afford. In Winchester, the geometry was simpler, and therefore more unforgiving. There were fewer rooms to move between, fewer crowds to be lost in, fewer excuses for proximity that could be attributed to the general press of a city. Here, to be seen twice with the same person was to be noticed. To be seen 3 times was to be discussed. To be seen 4 times was to have the matter settled in the minds of every drawing-room between the Close and the High Street, whether or not the parties involved had exchanged a word of significance. He had been seen with each of the 3 front-runners a number of times that Winchester was clearly finding satisfying. The calls, the dances, the concert, the garden party. Society was tabulating. What society was not tabulating, because society had not thought to look, was the number of times Sebastian had contrived, with a precision that would have embarrassed him if he had examined it honestly, to be in the same part of a room as Harriet Beaumont. He had not examined it honestly. He was working up to it. The occasion that made examination unavoidable was a picnic. It was organized by Mrs. Eldridge, Sophia's mother, with the cheerful ambition of a woman who understood that outdoor entertainments in fine weather created the kind of informal proximity that drawing rooms could not manufacture. The party assembled on the grounds of a neighboring estate, whose owner was away and whose housekeeper had, through some social alchemy Sebastian didn't entirely follow, agreed to the use of the south lawn. There were rugs and hampers and an excessive number of cushions, and Mrs. Eldridge had arranged the party with a skill that placed Sophia naturally near Sebastian for the first half hour, and Lady Portia naturally near him for the second. Harriet Beaumont had been invited because her father was on good terms with the Eldridges. She arrived with Sir Edmund, settled him in a shaded chair near the older guests, and then moved to the edge of the party, in the manner she had, which was not withdrawal. She was present, she spoke when spoken to, she was clearly enjoying the afternoon, but was something more like orbit. She circulated at a slight remove from the centre of things, as though the centre was a place she had assessed and found a little loud. Sebastian spent the first half hour in conversation with Sophia, who was sweet and warm and said several things that made him smile. He spent the second half hour deflecting Lady Portia's elegant assessment of his estates, which was admiring in a way that was also slightly transactional. He was not offended by this. He understood it. He simply found himself, at the conclusion of both conversations, looking toward the edge of the party. Harriet was in conversation with the housekeeper's daughter, a girl of about 12, who had apparently been permitted to stay and watch the proceedings, and who had, with the unerring instinct of children, attached herself to the one adult in the group who was most likely to treat her like a person. Harriet was showing her something in the grass, an insect it appeared, which she had caught in her handkerchief and was now releasing with the commentary of someone explaining something genuinely interesting. Sebastian excused himself from Lady Portia on the pretext of more lemonade and took the long route. "A grasshopper," said Harriet without looking up as he arrived beside her. "I see that." Eleanor had not seen one before. She lives in the city. Harriet watched the girl chase after the released insect with delighted incompetence. "I had not seen one either, until I was about 9. My brother caught one, and I thought it was the most marvelous thing." "And now?" "Now I find them interesting rather than marvelous." She stood brushing grass from her skirt. "Most things go that way, I think. You learn to see them clearly, and the wonder becomes something quieter." Sebastian considered this. "You don't find that a loss?" "I find it honest," she said. "I would rather see a thing as it is than preserve a sense of wonder that has no basis in reality." She paused. "That is a more austere position than I intended to state at a picnic." "I asked the question." "You did," she agreed, "as you say." He laughed. A short, genuine laugh, not the social variety. She looked at him with a flicker of something that might have been surprise. "So that phrase," he said, "you use it when you disagree." She was quiet for a moment. "Do I?" "You do. As you say. You say it, and then you say nothing more, which means whatever I have just said is either wrong or insufficient, and you have decided not to correct me." Harriet was still for a beat. Then, "That is a more precise observation than most people make. I pay attention." "Evidently." She looked across the party, where Mrs. Eldridge had succeeded in drawing Sophia and Lady Portia into a game of some kind. "Then you will have noticed that I use it when arguing is not worth the cost." "And when is arguing not worth the cost?" "When the other person is not yet ready to be persuaded," she said simply. "It costs nothing to wait." He stood beside her at the edge of the south lawn, with the cathedral faintly visible above the tree line, and the party continuing its cheerful business 20 feet away, and felt, with a clarity he found almost alarming, that he had not had a conversation he cared about in a very long time. After the picnic, Sebastian went home and sat in his study for an hour without reading anything. He was not by nature a man who avoided honest reckoning. He had avoided it once, with results that had cost him a season's dignity and a trusted friend, and he had decided, on the long road out of London, that he would not make the same error again. The engagement to Miss Frances Harlowe, which had not been an engagement in any honest sense, but a construction built from a misread situation, social pressure applied at the right moment by the right family, and his own failure to say clearly and early what he did and did not intend, had taught him something. It had taught him that the cost of avoiding a clear conversation was always higher than the cost of having it. He was avoiding a clear conversation with himself. The clear version was this. He had come to Winchester to consider 3 women, all of whom were eligible, sensible, and entirely suitable. He had been considering them conscientiously. He had also been finding reasons daily to be near a woman who was none of his stated business, whose company made the rest of the social season feel like a faint and unnecessary noise, and who had told him on their first meeting that she was entirely unremarkable. She was wrong about that. He had known she was wrong at the first assembly, and he knew it more thoroughly now. The question, the one he was sitting with in the study, not reading, was what he intended to do about it. The answer which he reached before the hour was out was, nothing yet. There were things he did not know. He did not know whether she felt anything beyond good conversation. He did not know whether the situation, his public position, the 3 women society had selected, the fact that he was conducting what amounted to an informal courtship in full view of a city that was taking notes, whether the situation was something she had observed and concluded from. He did not know whether, when she removed herself to the edges of rooms, she was making room for the women she assumed he wanted, or simply maintaining her natural orbit. He needed more information. He would pay attention. He was good at paying attention. He opened a book and read 3 pages before he realized they were upside down. The concert series continued on Friday. Sebastian arrived with no particular arrangement and found himself seated, by the kind of coincidence that Winchester was good at manufacturing, between Diana Carew and Lady Portia. This was not an uncomfortable position. Both women were good company. But it did mean that for the first half of the program, he had Diana's sharp commentary in one ear and Portia's quieter, more considered observations in the other, and both required responses, and the music, which was actually rather good, was not receiving the attention it deserved. Harriet was in the 3rd row. She had come with her father, who had fallen asleep by the 2nd piece with the contentment of a man who finds music soothing regardless of whether he is conscious for it. Harriet sat beside him and listened. Sebastian watched her listen. He was aware that this was not what he was supposed to be doing. He was also aware that Diana Carew, who was sharp and missed very little, had observed him doing it twice. She said nothing. He was beginning to find her restraint both a relief and a concern. During the interval, when Sir Edmund had been revived with tea and the general party had redistributed itself around the refreshment room, Sebastian crossed to where Harriet stood near the window. "The 2nd piece," he said. She turned. "Yes." "What did you make of it?" "It was melancholy," she said, "in the way that is a pleasure to feel, the kind of sadness that reminds you are alive." She paused. "That is a peculiar thing to say about music at a cathedral city concert." "It's accurate," he said. "You felt it too?" "I was watching—" He stopped. He had been about to say, "I was watching you listen to it," which was honest but premature. "The 2nd movement, yes." She looked at him for a moment, with that quality of attention she had, the kind that suggested she had noticed the gap in what he'd said and filed it somewhere. She did not press it. "My mother played," she said instead. "Not that piece, but music like it. I sometimes think certain pieces are just a door, and the other side is a conversation you can't quite have otherwise." "With whom?" "With whoever is gone," she said without sentimentality, just plainly. Sebastian was quiet. Then, "Yes." They stood for a moment at the window, while the interval continued around them, and whatever they were doing in that moment was not nothing. Across the room, Diana Carew watched with the expression of someone who has just confirmed a hypothesis she had been running for some time. The crisis, if a quiet Tuesday morning can be called a crisis, arrived at the lending library. Sebastian had come for a book which was genuine. He had also come because he had established, through the kind of observation he was no longer pretending was incidental, that Harriet Beaumont came to the lending library on Tuesday mornings. These 2 things were not unrelated. She was there. She was also, when he arrived, in conversation with Mr. Gerald Ashford, who had apparently extended his visit to Winchester on the grounds that his sister's company was agreeable and the city was pleasant. He was standing slightly closer to Harriet than the bookshelf strictly required, and he was smiling at something she had said with an expression that made his interest entirely legible to anyone paying attention. Sebastian paid attention. Harriet, for her part, was not leaning away from Mr. Ashford. She was engaged in the conversation, which was apparently about whether the circulating library in Bath held a superior selection. She was also, Sebastian noted, not quite smiling in the way she smiled at the grasshopper, or at the picnic's edge, or at the concert window. This was the polite version. He collected the book he had come for, greeted them both with the ease of a man who had not just experienced a feeling he was not prepared to name, and left. On the walk home he identified the feeling. It was not jealousy exactly, or it was jealousy in the way a clear sky can be described as simply not clouded. He was not a man who experienced things imprecisely. He turned the situation over. Mr. Ashford was a perfectly agreeable man with no discernible defect. If Harriet Beaumont encouraged his attentions, that was her business and her right. Sebastian had said nothing. He had done nothing. He had contrived a series of conversations in which he had been, on his own assessment, charming and interested, and, on at least 2 occasions, genuinely honest in ways he was not honest with many people. And she had been all of those things in return. But he had not said anything. He had been paying attention and waiting for more information, and apparently Mr. Ashford had no interest in waiting. He arrived home, sat in his study, and this time did not open any books. He wrote instead a letter he did not send, to nobody about nothing in particular, that ran to 3 pages before he set it aside. Then he sat for a while longer and concluded that he had better say something. He did not get the opportunity immediately, because Winchester had a social calendar, and the social calendar had momentum. There was a dinner at the Lennoxes on Wednesday, a large affair, 12 at table, the kind of evening that required full attention and left no margin for private conversation. Sebastian sat between Portia and the Colonel, who was Diana Carew's father, a formidable man who had read the same county history Harriet had mentioned, and who asked Sebastian pointed questions about land management that required actual answers. Portia was, on his other side, as elegant as always. She had the gift of making dinner conversation feel effortless, which Sebastian recognized as a significant talent and not an inconsiderable quality in a duchess. He watched her across the evening with the honest assessment of a man trying to do things properly. She was excellent. She would be an excellent choice. He knew this. He also knew that at no point in the evening did he think of anything she said after she said it. Harriet Beaumont was not at the dinner. The Beaumonts were not part of the Lennox circle in any particular way. This was not a slight, simply a feature of the city's overlapping social geometries. It was a fact Sebastian noted with a precision that told him everything he needed to know about the state of his own attention. After dinner, the gentlemen rejoined the ladies, and there was music. Sophia Eldridge played, beautifully as it happened, which Sebastian had not known. He made a note to tell her sincerely that she played well, because she did, and she deserved to hear it. He was not a man who withheld deserved acknowledgement. He said it on his way out, and she beamed at him with a warmth that was entirely without stratagem, and he felt momentarily the specific ache of a man who has found himself unable to want the right thing. Thursday brought a walk on the close with Diana Carew, which had been arranged, through the medium of her father and his own, as an informal opportunity that both parties understood. Diana walked with the brisk energy of someone who finds outdoor air more useful than most indoor conversation, and she spoke plainly about things that mattered: the state of the county's roads, a court case she had followed in the papers with evident interest, a question about his Derbyshire estate that was specific enough to surprise him. "You are well informed," he said. "I find it useful," she said, "though I notice you say it as though it's unexpected." "Unfairly so," he said. "Forgive me." "Already forgotten." She stopped at the cathedral's south face, looking up. "May I say something direct?" "Please." "I find you very agreeable company," she said, turning to him with her usual frank assessment. "You are intelligent and you listen, which are the 2 qualities that matter most in a long marriage. I am not without feeling on the matter." She paused. "But I do not believe your attention is where it appears to be, and I think you know that. And I think you are being very careful and very fair and very slow about it, and I would simply like you to know that I have noticed." She held his gaze. "That is all I intend to say on the subject." Sebastian looked at her for a moment. "You are remarkable," he said, and meant it entirely. "Yes," she said, without false modesty, and they walked on. He went to the Beaumonts that afternoon. Not a planned call, he had not sent a card. He came on foot, which was not how a duke typically arrived, and knocked with the brisk intention of a man who has decided on a course of action and does not want additional time to reconsider it. Harriet answered the door herself. This was clearly not the intended arrangement. A maid appeared behind her almost immediately, slightly breathless, but for a moment it was simply Harriet, in a plain day dress, with a book still in her hand, and the look of someone interrupted mid-sentence. "Your Grace," she said, not disconcerted, simply present. "Miss Beaumont." He had a reason prepared, a question about the Clarendon, a pretext about returning a volume. He found, standing at the door with her, looking at him with that quality of calm attention, that he did not want to use it. "I apologize for calling unannounced." "My father is in," she said. "He will be glad to see you." She stepped back. He came in. Sir Edmund was, in fact, very glad to see him, and talked for 20 minutes about a pamphlet he had read on the matter of agricultural reform, during which Sebastian sat and answered questions and was aware, with the peripheral precision that had become his constant companion over the past fortnight, that Harriet had taken her usual chair by the window and her book and had resumed reading. At a pause in the conversation, her father had gone to find the pamphlet itself, which had been shelved somewhere. Sebastian said, without planning to, "I saw you at the library on Tuesday." Harriet looked up. "Yes?" "With Mr. Ashford." A pause. "He is visiting his sister," she said. "We spoke about Bath." Her tone was entirely neutral. "Harris seems to find your company agreeable." "Most people find conversation about books agreeable," she said. "It is a fairly safe subject." "Miss Beaumont?" "Your Grace." Her voice was not sharp, it was, if anything, quieter than usual. "Mr. Ashford is a pleasant man. I have no particular feeling about Mr. Ashford." She looked at him steadily. "If there is something you wish to say, I wonder if you might simply say it." Sebastian opened his mouth. Sir Edmund returned with the pamphlet. He stayed another half-hour, discussing agricultural reform, and left without saying it. The thing he had not said sat with him through Friday and into Saturday, with the particular weight of something that has been picked up and set down too many times. He was not, he told himself, a coward. He was a man who had learned, at some cost, the difference between acting from clarity and acting from impulse, and he was trying, with diminishing success, to establish that what he felt was the former and not the latter. The evidence was not cooperating. He had been in Winchester for 3 weeks. He had done everything required of him, called on the right people, attended the right events, presented himself with the consistency and seriousness that the situation demanded. Society was observing. Society had views. Winchester had decided, in its slow, thorough way, that the Duke of Sorrel was taking his time, but would shortly arrive at a decision that the city would find satisfying, and the 3 candidates remained the 3 candidates, and Harriet Beaumont remained the woman nobody had thought to count. What Sebastian had not anticipated, had not, he admitted to himself, fully reckoned with, was the speed at which Harriet Beaumont might arrive at her own conclusions. He found out on Saturday. The occasion was a garden party at the Carews. The Colonel's estate sat just outside the close, with ground sufficient for a credible outdoor entertainment, and Diana had organised it with the same brisk efficiency she brought to most things. There were games on the lawn that Sebastian declined and then watched. There was a great deal of tea. The 3 frontrunners were all present, which gave the afternoon the pleasant tension of an event everyone pretended was casual and nobody believed was. Sebastian was looking for Harriet. She was not where she usually was, at the edge of things in mild orbit. She was in conversation with Diana Carew herself, near the garden wall, and the conversation appeared to be substantive. Sebastian was crossing the lawn toward them. No pretext, no manufactured route, when Lady Portia intercepted him with the elegance of a woman who does not appear to intercept people. "Your Grace." She fell into step beside him. "I wonder, might I have a direct word?" He stopped. "Of course." Portia was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for her. She was not a woman who gathered herself visibly. "I have enjoyed this season very much," she said at last. "Your company particularly." She paused. "I am aware that you are a thoughtful man, and that you are considering a number of situations with the care they deserve." She looked at him with a composure that cost her something. "I am not asking for a declaration. I am simply saying that I should like to know before the season ends whether my consideration of this situation is well placed." Sebastian looked at her. She was, he thought, one of the finest women he had met. She deserved honesty. "Lady Portia," he said, "I have enjoyed your company enormously. You are one of the most capable, perceptive people I have met this season or any other." He paused. "I cannot, in honesty, tell you that my consideration is where I think you deserve it to be." She was still for a moment. Then she nodded, once clean, no drama. "Thank you," she said. "That is considerably more kind than most men manage." "I am sorry," he said. "Don't be," said Portia. "I would rather know." She looked across the garden. "I suspect," she added with a faint, dry smile, "that I am not the only conversation you need to have this afternoon." She moved away. Sebastian turned back toward the garden wall. The wall was empty. Harriet and Diana had moved. He found Diana alone at the tea table. The expression on her face when she saw him told him, with a cold clarity, that something had happened. "Where is Miss Beaumont?" he asked. Diana looked at him steadily. "She went inside," she said. "About 5 minutes ago." A pause. "We had a conversation." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind," said Diana with precision, "where I was a friend telling a friend what I had observed, and my friend drew her own conclusions." She set down her teacup. I may have been rather more informative than was wise. What did you tell her? Diana looked at him with her frank assessment. I told her that you were a very attentive man, she said, and that your attention had been, for some weeks, quite consistently directed. She paused. I had assumed this would be welcome information. And it was not. She thanked me, said Diana carefully. She said, and I am quoting precisely, he has a great deal to consider, and I am not part of his consideration. And then she went inside. A beat. She said it very calmly. Sebastian set down his own cup with more force than he intended. She is wrong. Then, said Diana, I would strongly suggest you go and tell her so. He found her in the library. The Carews' library, small and book-lined and currently uninhabited, except for Harriet, who was standing at the window with her back to the door, not looking at any books. She heard him come in. She did not turn. Miss Beaumont, he said. Your Grace. Her voice was entirely steady. I was just collecting myself. To go back out? Yes. She turned then. Her face was composed, her posture was composed, everything about her was composed in the way of a woman who has had practice at composure and who is applying it now with some effort. It is a very pleasant party. It is, he said. Harriet. She looked at him. The use of her name produced something brief in her expression that she suppressed immediately. I understand, she said, that you have a great deal to consider, that you came to this city with a number of legitimate and serious— Stop, he said. She stopped. He crossed the room. Not to touch her, he stopped at a proper distance, a few feet, close enough that this was a private conversation and not a speech. You are wrong, he said, about not being part of my consideration. A pause. Am I? You have been part of my consideration, he said, since approximately the first assembly, when you warned me about Lady Portia's approach, and then said you found being overlooked restful, and I spent the entirety of the next dance thinking about what that meant. Harriet looked at him. Something was happening in her face that she was not quite managing to suppress. You have been, he continued, the reason I have taken the long route past the lending library on 3 separate occasions. The reason the second movement of Friday's concert is the only piece I can recall clearly. The reason— He stopped. He had been making this speech in some form for 3 weeks without knowing it, and the version he was delivering now was not measured or prepared, and he found he preferred it that way. You said at the Carews' picnic that most things go from marvelous to merely interesting when you see them clearly. I have not found that to be the case with you. I have found the opposite. The library was very quiet. You have been calling on Lady Portia, Harriet said slowly, and Miss Carew and Miss Eldridge for 3 weeks. Yes. Society has been quite unanimous about— Society, said Sebastian, has been watching the wrong thing. She was still for a long moment. Outside, the garden party continued. Someone laughed at something. A door opened somewhere in the house and closed again. I stepped back, she said finally. I saw what I thought I saw, and I stepped back because I do not— She stopped, tried again. I do not compete. I know, he said. I know you don't. And I should have been clearer sooner, and I was not, because I was trying to be certain before I said anything irreversible, and in the process I was insufficiently clear, and you reached entirely the wrong conclusion with entirely reasonable logic, and that is my fault. Harriet looked at him for a long moment. Her hands at her sides were very still. What? She said carefully. Are you saying— I am saying, said Sebastian, that I would like to call on you properly, with intention. If that is something you would— Yes, she said. Not quickly. It was not an impulsive answer. It was the answer of a woman who had just understood something and was confirming it with the precision she brought to most things. Yes, I would like that. The library remained very quiet. Sebastian felt something unknot in his chest that had been knotted for approximately 3 weeks, and possibly for 2 years before that. Good, he said. Good, she agreed. Outside, someone called for a game on the lawn. Neither of them moved toward the door immediately. They stood in the small library with the garden party continuing without them, and looked at each other with the feeling of 2 people who have just arrived, slightly breathless, at the same place from different directions. As you say, said Harriet very quietly. This time it did not mean I disagree and will not argue. It meant something else entirely. Sebastian found that he understood exactly what it meant. The call he made the following Monday was different from the Thursday call, and everyone in the Beaumont household appeared to understand this, except possibly Sir Edmund, who was simply delighted to have company, Sebastian sent a card this time. He arrived at the correct hour. He was shown in by the maid who had previously appeared breathless behind Harriet at the door, and who now admitted him with the careful composure of a young woman who had been spoken to about composure. Sir Edmund received him in the sitting room, and talked for the first quarter hour about the pamphlet on agricultural reform, which he had now read twice, and found even more compelling on the second pass. Harriet sat by the window. She had her needlework, which Sebastian had not previously seen her employ, and which she appeared to be using as something to do with her hands, rather than as a genuine occupation. She looked up when he arrived. She did not look away immediately. This was new, or rather it was not new, but it was no longer suppressed, and the difference was significant. After the first quarter hour, Sir Edmund remembered an appointment with his solicitor that had apparently slipped his mind, apologized with the vague sincerity of a man who believed what he was saying, and left them with the door open and the maid visible in the hall and all the proprieties intact. The sitting room without Sir Edmund was a different room. "You sent a card," said Harriet. "I did." "You didn't before?" "No." He settled in his chair. "I was not before calling with intention." She looked at her needlework. "And now you are?" "Yes." A pause. Outside, a cart went past. The cathedral bell marked the half-hour. Harriet set the needlework down and looked at him with the directness she had, the quality that appeared when she had decided that circling a thing was less efficient than addressing it. "I should like to understand," she said, "the situation with Miss Harlow." Sebastian had expected this. He was glad she had asked it plainly. "What do you know of it?" "What everyone knows," she said. "Which is the public version, which I suspect is not the complete one. The public version is that we were engaged, and the engagement was dissolved by mutual agreement." He paused. "The complete version is that the engagement was never honest. Her family had social leverage over mine through a matter involving my younger brother. There was a situation, a misread situation, partly my fault for not being clear, and her father moved quickly. By the time I understood the construction, the announcement had been made, and undoing it would have cost my brother considerably more than it cost me to proceed." He said this without self-pity, simply as fact. The dissolution came 18 months later, when the matter that had given them leverage was resolved. Harriet was quiet for a moment. "And Miss Harlow herself?" "She understood the arrangement," he said. "She was not happy about the dissolution, but not for the reasons one might assume. She had decided that she could be content with a practical match, and she resented, I think, having that prospect removed." He met her gaze. "I do not believe she was in love with me. I was not in love with her. That is the least romantic version of events, but it is the true one." "I appreciate the true one," said Harriet. "I know you do." She picked up the needlework again, looked at it, set it down again. "May I ask, when you came to Winchester, was it truly to consider the season, or was it to be seen to consider it?" It was a precise question. He gave it a precise answer. "Both," he said. "I needed to re-establish myself after the engagement. A visible season in a respectable city, conducted properly, would accomplish that. And I did come intending to consider seriously. I was not performing interest I did not feel with any of them." He paused. "I simply found, very quickly, that my interest had organized itself somewhere society was not expecting it to." Harriet absorbed this. "Diana Carew would have been a good choice," she said. "Not bitterly, analytically." "She would," he agreed. "She knows it, and I told her honestly that my attention was elsewhere, and she accepted it with more grace than I deserved. She is remarkable." "She is." He watched her. "Are you going to tell me that any of the three would have suited me better?" Harriet considered this with genuine seriousness. "No," she said finally. "I was going to when you walked into the library on Saturday. I had a very composed speech prepared about how you had excellent options, and I wished you well." She looked at him with a faint, dry quality. "It was a very good speech." "I'm sorry to have interrupted it." "You are not sorry at all." "No," he said, "I am not." The corner of her mouth moved. He had come to understand over the past weeks that this was as close as she came to laughing at things that genuinely delighted her, and that it was worth considerably more than another woman's full smile. The week that followed was the best week Sebastian had spent in some years, and also the most uncomfortable, because comfort was not quite the point. He called on Tuesday. They walked in the cathedral close on Wednesday, with Sir Edmund, who walked at a pace that naturally resulted in a distance between them sufficient for private conversation. He attended the Thursday assembly with no particular arrangement and found her there, and they danced once, which was within the bounds of decorum and which was the first time he had danced with her. She was not a showy dancer. She was precise. She knew the figures and executed them without fuss and paid attention to the music rather than to whether she was being watched. In the turn where the figures brought them close, she looked at him with a composure that was not indifference, and he was aware acutely, inconveniently, that he had been waiting for this for some weeks. "You are thinking about something," she said during a figure. "Several things. Anything you intend to say aloud." "Not in a ballroom," he said, "with 16 other couples and your father in the corner." She considered this. "That is fair," she said. The figure separated them. When it brought them back, "Sebastian," he said. She looked at him. He had used his own name, deliberately, quietly, in the middle of a dance figure, as an offering. "Sebastian," she repeated, testing it, deciding. The figure separated them again. What Winchester made of it all was predictable, and in parts unpleasant. The shift in Sebastian's visible attentions had not gone unremarked. Winchester was small, and its social machinery, while slower than London's, was thorough. The calls on the 3 frontrunners had ceased, which was information. The calls on Sir Edmund Beaumont had not ceased, which was also information. These 2 pieces of information, set beside each other, produced a conclusion that the city was in the process of reaching with the deliberate momentum of a wheel that has found its downhill slope. Mrs. Eldridge was the first to speak plainly about it, to Sophia, and then in modified form to her sister-in-law, and then, less modified, to the wife of a canon who had a talent for distribution. The substance of what she said was not malicious. It was simply the observation, delivered with the genuine bewilderment of a woman whose social mathematics had been disrupted, that the Duke of Sorrel appeared to have formed a preference for Miss Beaumont, which was, she did not say surprising, she said unexpected. And in Winchester these 2 words occupied the same social register. Harriet heard about it on Friday, from her friend Mrs. Gale, who was 3 years older and considerably more familiar with the mechanics of close gossip, and who reported it with the loving frankness of a woman who believed in preparation. Harriet received this information over tea in Mrs. Gale's sitting room, with the composure she brought to most things, thanked her friend for telling her, and walked home with an expression that gave nothing away. She gave something away at dinner. Sir Edmund, who was not observant in general but was observant about his daughter, put down his fork and asked what the matter was. "Nothing of consequence," said Harriet. "Harriet." She was quiet for a moment, then, "People are talking about the Duke's calls here, about what it means." "Of course they are," said Sir Edmund comfortably. "This is Winchester." "It concerns me," she said. "Which part?" She looked at her plate. "I have not been counted, Papa. For 3 years in this city I have been entirely, beside the point, socially, and I have found it restful. And now I am counted. And I don't know whether what is being said is what is true, and I don't know whether—" She stopped, started again more carefully. "I do not wish to be wrong about this. I have been wrong before when I thought I was reading the situation correctly, and the cost was not nothing." Sir Edmund looked at his daughter for a long moment. He was, beneath the comfortable vagueness, a man who had watched his daughter carry her mother's death and run his household and step back from things she wanted without ever being asked. "What did he say?" he asked carefully, "when he called, the first time with intention?" She told him, not everything, but enough. Sir Edmund listened and nodded and picked up his fork again. "My dear," he said, "I think you may be at liberty to trust the thing you are trying not to trust." Harriet looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her plate. "As you say," she said, "and this time for the first time in years it did not mean I disagree and will not argue. It meant I am trying." The complication arrived in the form of a letter. It came on Saturday morning, addressed to Sebastian, forwarded from his London house, which meant it had been chasing him for some days. He recognized the handwriting before he broke the seal. Francis Harlowe's elder brother, Reginald Harlowe. The letter was 3 pages. Sebastian read it twice, folded it, and sat for a long time with it in his hand. The substance was this. Francis was unwell. Not seriously, not dangerously, but she had been suffering since the dissolution, more than the family had understood at the time, and Reginald was writing to say that a renewed acquaintance, not a renewed attachment, he was careful to say, simply a civil acknowledgement, a letter perhaps, something that would indicate there was no ill feeling, might do her some good. He wrote without apology, and without particular warmth, in the manner of a man who believed he was owed something, and was calling it in through the back door. Sebastian set the letter down. He was not going to write to Francis Harlow. He was clear about that. The engagement had been a construction, and the dissolution had been the first honest act either of their families had performed in the matter, and reopening any form of communication was not something he intended and would not serve Francis or himself. He understood why Reginald had written. The Harlow family had lost a duke, and they had not finished accounting for that loss. This was the accounting. What stayed with him, and what he could not entirely shake, was the reminder that the engagement had cost him something it had not finished costing. His reputation in London remained complicated in ways that a Winchester season could repair, but not entirely erase. If he formed a serious attachment here, if he came out of this city with an engagement to a baronet's daughter, quiet and unremarkable, it would be read in London as a further retreat. A duke who had been manoeuvred into one engagement and had now settled in obscurity for a second-tier match. That was not how he saw it. It was how London would. He did not care about London in any general sense. He cared about what London's reading would mean for Harriet, for a woman who had spent 3 years being quietly invisible, and who would, if he proceeded, become suddenly and unavoidably visible, and visible in a narrative that was not entirely kind. He had not asked her about this. He had been, he acknowledged to himself, somewhat focused on his own wanting and had not fully reckoned with what he was asking her to step into. He put the letter in his desk drawer and went for a long walk. When he came back, he sat and wrote, not to Reginald Harlow, but a second letter he did not send. This one 2 pages, addressed to nobody. He read it over. It was, he thought, the clearest thing he had written in some time. He set it aside and went to bed. He called on Tuesday. The difference from previous Tuesdays was that Sir Edmund had an actual appointment with his actual solicitor. Harriet had mentioned it Friday on the close in passing, and Sebastian had noted it and said nothing about the implications. She met him in the sitting room, the door open, the maid in the hall, the proprieties. They talked for a few minutes about the letter, not Francis Harlow's letter, which he had not told her about yet, but a letter she had received from her brother in Bath, which had described a concert series with the competitive detail of a man who believed his sister's Winchester season ought to be feeling slightly inferior. She relayed this with a dry affection that made Sebastian laugh. Then she looked at him with the quality of attention she had when she had noticed something and was deciding whether to name it. "There is something," she said. "Yes. So you have been not quite here this past week." He had thought he was managing it better than that. "I received a letter," he said. He told her about it plainly, not the whole of it, but the substance. Reginald Harlow, the request, what he had declined to do. Harriet listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you telling me this," she said carefully, "because you are reconsidering something, or because you felt I should know?" "Because you should know," he said, "and because there is something else I want to say which is connected." She waited. "Winchester is repairing things that London damaged," he said. "You know this. You are not unaware of what this season looks like and what it was intended to accomplish. If we... He stopped and began again with more precision. "What I am building here with you is not a retreat. It is not a lesser version of what London expected, I know that. But London will not read it that way, not immediately. And the reading will attach to you as much as to me, and I have not been sufficiently honest with myself about whether I have asked you to consider that." Harriet looked at him for a long moment. "You are asking," she said slowly, "whether I understand what I am choosing." "Yes." She was quiet again, not the suppressed quiet, the thinking kind. He waited. "I have been invisible in this city for 3 years," she said at last. "I chose it. I found it restful, as I told you at the first assembly, and I was not wrong about that." She looked at her hands. "London's reading of things has never been particularly relevant to my life here. The people whose opinion I value are in this room and in this city, and they are, on the evidence, not unkind." She looked up. "I am not naive about the cost. I am saying that the cost, as I understand it, is a cost I am willing to pay." Sebastian looked at her with a feeling he recognized from the library, that sense of 2 people arriving at the same place from different directions, except this time the distance was shorter. "You are certain," he said. "I am," she said, "though I notice you are not asking whether I have feeling on the matter. You are asking whether I have counted the cost." "I know you have feeling on the matter," he said. "You have made that sufficiently clear. Have I? She looked at him with a faint surprise. I thought I was being rather circumspect. You were, he said. I pay attention. The corner of her mouth moved. Yes, she said. I have noticed that about you. Outside the half-hour struck. The maid's shadow moved in the hallway, the proprieties intact. Sebastian sat and looked at Harriet Beaumont, who was looking back at him with composure that was not distance but its opposite. Composure as the form that certainty took in a woman who did not perform what she felt. He thought of the first assembly, and the warning about Lady Portia and the lemonade and the phrase she had used, without knowing he was cataloguing it. He thought of the lending library and the grasshopper, and the concert window and the Clarendon, and the library at the Carews' garden party, and every conversation in between. He thought, I have been building to this for some time. Harriet, he said. Sebastian, she said, using his name for only the second time deliberately, as she had decided to in the ballroom and had evidently not revoked. I intend to speak to your father. She held his gaze. I know, she said. Is that? Yes, she said, it is. Sir Edmund Beaumont, when Sebastian spoke to him the following morning, took about 45 seconds to agree. This was not inattention. It was the speed of a man who had been watching his daughter for 3 years and had arrived at his own conclusions well before anyone asked. He shook Sebastian's hand with genuine warmth, said something about Harriet's mother that made Sebastian feel he had been entrusted with something, and then, with the excellent instinct of a father who understood the geometry of the moment, went to find her and sent her in. Harriet came into the study with the composure she always had, which no longer read to Sebastian as reserve, but as the form her certainty took. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the 45 seconds her father had taken apparently told the story, because she said nothing and he said nothing, and the room was very quiet and completely sufficient. Then she said, Did he make you tea? He offered, said Sebastian. He then forgot to call anyone, and we sat for 10 minutes in a shared understanding that the tea was not arriving. That is, said Harriet, a very accurate account of a conversation with my father. He crossed the room to her. Not to touch her, there were still proprieties, but close. The right distance for something that was no longer merely acquaintance, and not yet everything it was going to be. I should like, he said, to be clear about what I'm asking. Please. I am not asking because you are suitable, he said. You are suitable, but that is not the reason. I am not asking because the season required a conclusion, or because my situation required repair, or because you were available and agreeable, and happened to be in Winchester at a convenient moment. He paused. I am asking because every conversation I have had with you has been the most honest I have managed in a very long time, and I find that I do not want to stop. I find that the prospect of Winchester ending and returning to London, and not having this... He stopped, tried again. I am asking because you are the person I want to talk to, about everything, for a very long time. Harriet was still. Something was moving in her face that she was not suppressing. You are not going to tell me, she said, that I was your obvious choice because I was not. No, he said, you were not. Society had quite clear ideas about who... Society, he said, was watching the wrong thing. As I believe I have previously said. You did say that. She looked at him steadily. I have been thinking about it since, whether it was true, whether I was... She paused. I was not counted, Sebastian. I want to be certain that I was not simply the default, the one who remained when the others were set aside. He understood what she was asking. He understood why she was asking it, and what it had cost her to ask it directly instead of circling it. And he loved her. He was quite clear in that moment that the word was exact, for the precision of it. May I tell you something, he said, about the first assembly? Yes. I noticed you before I was introduced to Lady Portia, he said. Before any of the three, you were standing at the windows and you were watching a conversation near the fireplace with the expression of someone who had heard the punchline already and was waiting for the room to catch up. And I thought that is the most interesting person in this room, and I want to know what they are thinking. He held her gaze. Lady Portia was introduced to me. Diana Carew assessed me from across the room, and I noticed and found it bracing. Sophia Eldridge shook my hand and made me feel briefly that we had been friends for years. All of this happened. He paused. And then I found myself next to you at the refreshment table, and you told me you were entirely unremarkable, and that you found it restful, and I decided you were wrong, and I have not revised that decision. She looked at him for a long moment. "You never said anything," she said, "for weeks." "I was trying to be certain," he said. "I was trying not to repeat a previous error. And I waited too long and you drew the wrong conclusion and stepped back, which is entirely my fault, and I am sorry for it." "I stepped back because I did not know," she said. "I would not have stepped back if I had known." "I know that now." "You could have simply told me," she said. And there was something in her voice, not quite reproach, but the dry edge of a woman pointing out an inefficiency. "I could have," he agreed. "It would have been faster, less operatic." "Considerably. Will you forgive the opera?" She looked at him with the expression that was not quite a smile. "I will consider it," she said. "You may ask me again in 10 years, and I will give you my final assessment." "That," said Sebastian, "is exactly the kind of answer I expected from you." "Good," said Harriet. "I should hate to become predictable." He looked at her, this woman who had stood at the edge of rooms and waited for things to be worth her attention, and carried her mother's absence without performance, and read county histories and said, "As you say," when she disagreed, and had, somehow, managed to be entirely invisible to a city that had been watching the wrong thing for 3 weeks. He thought of the first assembly and the lemonade and every conversation since, and he thought that he had arrived at this point by the slowest possible route, and that it had been, despite everything, exactly the right one. "Harriet," he said. "Sebastian," she said, "will you marry me?" It was not a question quite. It was said with the confidence of a man who had been paying attention for long enough to know the answer. She heard the confidence and did not find it presumptuous. She found it honest. "Yes," she said. Simply, immediately, without the performance of deliberation she did not feel. "Yes, I will." The announcement, when it was made, produced exactly the response Winchester's social machinery was capable of. There was surprise, genuine surprise, because nobody had been watching Harriet Beaumont. There was a period of retrospective accounting, in which people remembered the calls and the concerts and the walks on the close, and revised their memory to include a context they had missed. There was a small brief flutter of feeling in 3 households, Lennox, Carew and Eldridge, that resolved itself with varying speed into something gracious. Diana Carew sent a note. It said, "I suspected as much from the picnic. You are both, I think, exactly what the other needs. My very warm congratulations." It arrived before the announcement was formally circulated, which told Sebastian that Diana's information was faster than Winchester's, and that he should probably never play cards against her. Sophia Eldridge said when she saw Harriet at the final assembly of the season that she was so pleased, and meant it with the uncomplicated warmth she brought to everything. Harriet thanked her, and meant the thanks. Lady Portia wrote a short, elegant letter to Sebastian that said nothing more than she wished him very well, and signed it with a signature that revealed nothing. Sebastian read it once, respected it enormously, and did not mention it to anyone. The final assembly of the Winchester season was not a grand occasion. It was the same room, the same orchestra, the same chandelier that had one branch slightly lower than the others, and that Harriet had spent 3 years standing below without ever quite getting used to. The same families, the same conversation patterns, the same tendency of the refreshment table to run short of lemonade at the precise moment one wanted some. It was different in every way that mattered. Sebastian arrived without a party arrangement. He arrived and found her. She was near the windows, where she always was, her usual position at the edge of things, except that she turned when he entered, and he walked to her without needing to find a reason. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Beaumont," he said, and then quietly, "Harriet." "That," she said, "will need to stop in public in approximately 3 weeks." "I know." He stood beside her at the windows. "I find I'm enjoying the last days of the old form." She looked at the room. "Do you know," she said, "that I have stood at these windows for 3 years and watched this room, and felt very comfortable being beside the point." "I know." "I am not sure what to make," she said, "of suddenly being the point." "You will get used to it," he said. "I suspect you will manage it very well." "As you say," said Harriet, "and this time, the 4th time in this new order of things, it did not mean I disagree, and it did not mean I am trying, and it did not mean I will not argue. It meant, yes, I believe you, I am choosing to believe you, I have decided to trust this." It was the completest form it had ever taken. Sebastian heard all of it. He always heard all of it. "Dance with me," he said. She put her hand in his. They went to the floor. It was 2 weeks later, on a morning in early October when the close was beginning to go gold, and Sir Edmund had gone to his solicitor again, genuinely this time to arrange certain papers, that she asked him. They were in the sitting room, the two of them, Harriet with the needlework she still used as something to do with her hands, and Sebastian with the county history he had borrowed and was reading with more honest attention than he had brought to anything in Winchester's lending library. The maid was somewhere in the house. The door was open. The proprieties. It had been, Sebastian thought, the most comfortable fortnight of his adult life. Harriet set down the needlework. She looked at him with the look he had come to know, direct, precise, the look that preceded a question she had been turning over for some time and had decided to ask plainly. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Then ask." She looked at him steadily. "Were you ever going to choose one of them?" she said. If the library at the Carews had not happened, was Lady Portia, or Diana, or Sophia, was any of them actually a real consideration? Or had you—" She paused. "Had you already decided?" Sebastian set the history down. He thought about this with the seriousness it deserved, because she was asking seriously, and she deserved an honest answer. "I came to Winchester intending to consider seriously," he said. "I have told you this." "Yes." "And I did consider. They are all remarkable women, and I would not insult them or you by pretending otherwise." "I know that," she said. "That is not what I am asking." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think," he said carefully, "that I knew at the first assembly, not in the way one knows a mathematical proof, not that certain, not that complete, but in the way one knows when something is going to matter before one has finished understanding why." He met her gaze. "I considered seriously because I believed I should, because the situation called for it and they deserved it, and because I was trying not to move quickly on the basis of feeling before I understood the ground." He paused. "But when I look back, I think the ground was always the same ground." Harriet held his gaze. She was very still. "So when you say," she said slowly, "that I was never your first choice—" "You were never my first choice," he said. The room went quiet. He let it. Let the phrase stand in the air exactly as it was. Let her hear it completely. Let the silence do what silence does when it is not empty but full. Full of the 3 weeks, and the lemonade, and the lending library, and the library at the garden party, and the dance and the study and all of it. Let her sit with it for a moment. This woman who did not perform and who deserved honesty, and who had asked the question directly and deserved the answer the same way. "Then you were my only choice." The silence after it was the kind that changes things. Harriet looked at him. Something crossed her face. Not a storm, nothing dramatic, but the specific expression of a woman who has been carrying a small, unasked question for some weeks and has just had it answered in a way she did not expect and cannot quite immediately account for. The composure was there still, but behind it something was happening that was too large and too quiet at the same time. "That is not what I expected you to say," she said finally. "I know." You could have simply. The first answer would have been, "True," he said, "and incomplete." She looked at him for a long moment. The needlework was in her lap, forgotten. The county history was closed on the arm of his chair. Outside, the cathedral close was going its slow October gold, and the bells would mark the hour in a few minutes, and Winchester was continuing in its deliberate, long-memoried way, without reference to the 2 people in the Beaumont sitting room who were, in that moment, not available to it. "Your only choice?" she said quietly. Not a question, hearing it again. "My only choice," he confirmed. She was still. He waited. This was, he knew, not a woman who needed managing toward a response. She was deciding in her thorough way how to receive a thing she had not known she was waiting for. "I was standing at the windows," she said at last. "At the first assembly. I was watching a conversation near the fireplace and thinking that the punchline had been visible for 3 exchanges, and that everyone was taking a very long time." She looked at him with something that was not quite a smile and also entirely was. "And then a man appeared at the refreshment table who looked like he had arrived in Winchester with every intention of being somewhere else and had not quite finished accounting for the change." Sebastian looked at her. "And you thought—" "I thought," she said, "that he was the most interesting person in the room." A pause. "I did not say anything because it seemed beside the point." "Harriet." "I know," she said. "We were both very foolish." "We were. We wasted 3 weeks." "We did." "I blame you," she said primarily. "That is fair," he said. "I accept it." The corner of her mouth moved. The real version. The one that was worth more than another woman's full smile. Then it became, for once, the full thing. She was, he thought, extraordinary when she smiled like that, not because it transformed her, but because it was simply her completely. Without the composure she wore like a well-fitted coat. "As you say," said Harriet. He understood immediately that this was the last version, the completed version, the one that had been building since the refreshment table at the first assembly, through every form it had taken between then and now. Agreement, argument, patience, trying, trust, and now this, a phrase that meant, "I choose you. I have chosen you. I knew at the first assembly, and I am very glad we arrived here even by the longest route." Sebastian reached across the space between their chairs, proper distance, proprieties intact, the door still open, and took her hand. She let him. She turned her hand over and held his back. Outside, the cathedral bell began to mark the hour. Winchester continued. The close went its quiet gold. In the sitting room with the too many books and the not quite enough furniture, two people who had both been standing at the edge of things for long enough sat together in the uncomplicated rightness of being at last at the point. The baby arrived in March, which was inconvenient in the way that March always is. Cold enough to make the fires necessary, warm enough to make them stuffy, with weather that could not decide between winter and something better and settled most days, for both at once. Sebastian had been informed of the progression of events by the midwife. At intervals he found insufficient, standing in the corridor outside their bedroom with the particular helplessness of a man accustomed to managing things who has encountered a situation that cannot be managed. Sir Edmund, who had come up from Winchester in February on the grounds that he wished to see Derbyshire in winter, and that this had nothing whatsoever to do with his daughter's confinement, sat with him for 2 hours in the corridor, playing cards with the cheerful equanimity of a man who had done this once before and survived it. Sebastian lost 4 successive hands without noticing. When the midwife opened the door and said, "A girl, your grace," and "her grace is very well," he was inside the room before she finished the sentence. Harriet was sitting up against the pillows with the expression of someone who has accomplished something considerable and is aware of it. She was pale and her hair was down, and she looked, Sebastian thought, like herself. Entirely, essentially herself, with no composure required because there was nothing here to compose herself against. The baby was in her arms, very small, dark-haired, which Sebastian had not expected, with the temporary redness of the newborn and the expression of someone who had recently arrived somewhere and found the arrangements not entirely to their satisfaction. "She looks," said Harriet, "extremely opinionated." "She has," said Sebastian, sitting on the edge of the bed and looking at his daughter. "Excellent precedent for that." Harriet looked at him. "She has your chin. She has your expression. She has been alive for 11 minutes. It is already legible," he said. Harriet looked back at the baby. Something moved across her face. Not the composure, not the dry wit, something underneath both of those. Something that had no name except the right one, which was simply love in its most unguarded form. Sebastian watched it happen and did not say anything about it because some things did not require commentary. He reached out and touched the baby's hand, the whole fist smaller than he had imagined, which closed reflexively around his finger with a grip that was surprisingly certain for something that had been in the world for 11 minutes. "Hello," he said quietly to his daughter. The baby did not respond. She was, on reflection, very new. He gave her time. They had married the previous April in Winchester, in the cathedral. Because Sir Edmund had expressed a mild preference for it, and Harriet had said, "as you say," in the tone, that meant, "I would also like this very much, and will not say so, because it sounds sentimental." Sebastian had booked the cathedral. It had been a clear day, which April in Hampshire was not required to provide, and had provided anyway as though the weather had been told the occasion and decided to cooperate. The close had been bright and cold in the morning and warm by the time they came out, and Harriet had stood on the cathedral steps in ivory silk, not the grey. She had been very decided about not the grey, and looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before. He had seen her composed. He had seen her amused. He had seen her honest and direct and quietly devastating. He had not, until that morning, seen her radiant. It suited her in a way that did not surprise him and undid him anyway. After the ceremony, after the breakfast, after Sir Edmund's speech, which was warm and slightly rambling, and made Harriet press her lips together to keep from crying. After all of it, there had been a moment in the small ante-room off the hall, between the breakfast and the carriage, where they had been briefly, improbably alone. Harriet had looked at him. He had looked at her. The door was not entirely closed. "Harriet," he said. "Sebastian," she said. He crossed the room and kissed her. Not the careful, correct kiss that had been their public allowance since the engagement, but the real one, the one that had been waiting since the refreshment table at the first assembly, through every conversation and every, as you say, and every circuit of the cathedral close. She kissed him back with an enthusiasm that was entirely uncharacteristic of her public composure, and entirely characteristic of everything underneath it, her hands in his lapels, and he thought, with the small, clear part of his mind that was still capable of thought, that he had been waiting for this specific moment since approximately October, and that it had been worth every patient week. When they separated, she looked at him with bright eyes and the expression that was not quite a smile, and entirely was. "We wasted a great deal of time," she said. "We did," he agreed. "I still blame you," she said. "I know," he said, and kissed her again. In the bedroom at Sorrel, with the March fire going and the baby asleep in the cradle beside the bed, and Sir Edmund audible somewhere down the corridor telling the housekeeper about the agricultural situation in Hampshire, with the enthusiasm of a man who has been kept from conversation for 2 hours, Sebastian sat beside his wife and held her hand. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am extremely well," she said. "I am tired and extremely well." "She has your stubbornness." "She has been alive for 40 minutes. 40 minutes is sufficient," he said. "I have data." Harriet leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her with the ease of a year of marriage, which had turned out to be the easiest thing he had done in some time. Not uncomplicated, Harriet was not a woman who produced an uncomplicated life. She had opinions and read everything, and was seldom wrong and knew it, but easy in the way that right things are easy. The way a room feels when the furniture is finally where it belongs. "What shall we call her?" said Harriet. "I thought we had agreed on Margaret." "We had agreed on Margaret as a possibility," she said. "I'm now looking at her and reconsidering. She has been alive for 43 minutes. "She looks," said Harriet, "like an Eleanor." Sebastian looked at the baby, who was asleep in the cradle with the perfect unconsciousness of the newly arrived, dark-haired and small, and already, somehow, entirely present. He thought of a girl of 12 at a garden party in Winchester, chasing a released grasshopper across a lawn, and Harriet crouched in the grass explaining something with the attention she brought to things she found genuinely interesting. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes," said Harriet. "As you say," said Sebastian. She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. The expression on her face was the complete one, the one that meant, "I choose you. I have chosen you. I am very glad we arrived here." He had seen it every day for a year, and it had not become ordinary. He did not expect it to. He kissed her temple. She settled back against his shoulder. The fire went on. Eleanor slept. Outside, Derbyshire was beginning, slowly and against its better judgment, to consider spring.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.